Okay, I hope that this video will help solve the mystery of when to use commas. Now, we've already talked about commas a little bit, and we've talked about using commas with subordinate conjunctions and with coordinating conjunctions and with transitional elements. And so what you may have noticed is that we use commas in those cases not to join information, but actually to separate information. We're using that comma to separate the transition from the main sentence. We use a comma to separate the two independent clauses when we're joining with a fanboy. Or we use that comma to separate the dependent clause from the independent clause when we're using a subordinate conjunction at the beginning of a sentence. A lot of times people think that commas are to join sentences, but they're actually not. It's to separate out extra information away from the main clause or the independent clause of a sentence. For example, here, if you don't use a comma, you have grandma as the direct object of what you're going to eat. Let's eat grandma means that you are a very terrible child and you're going to eat your grandmother. But let's eat comma grandma is an invitation to grandma to join you to eat some food. So you can see sometimes that using the correct punctuation can make a really big difference. Okay, take a look at this example. My heroes are my parents, Superman, and Wonder Woman. Okay, so in this case, we have a list of things. Maybe I'll look at this example first. I like chocolates, comma, ice cream, comma, and cake. So I have a list of 3 items. I use commas to separate out those items in my list. In my second sentence, I like chocolates and strawberries. So I have just 2 items in my list. When you have 2 items in your list, you actually don't use a comma. So sometimes people are confused about whether or not they should use the comma before the and when they have a list. Take a look here. If you don't use the comma before the and, what happens? It gets confusing. Are your heroes your parents and Superman and Wonder Woman? According to this sentence, your parents are Superman and Wonder Woman. And maybe that's not exactly what you mean. So using the comma before the and when you've got 3 or more items in your list is considered optional, and it's called the Oxford comma, but I think it's a very good idea to avoid confusion like you have here. All right, so that is reason number 1 to use a comma. You use a comma to separate items in a list of 3 or more items. Here's another time that you would use a comma. Let's look at these examples. In times of stress, comma, I eat a lot of chocolate. Therefore, comma, I gain weight. So you've seen these types of commas before. Here, the reason that we're using a comma is after a transition or some other introductory word or introductory phrase, and we're using that comma to separate that introductory phrase, that comma, or sorry, that transition. We're using that comma to separate it from the main independent clause, the main sentence. And you can see here I've highlighted the subject and the verb, and this is the indicator. Here is the actual sentence. What comes before it is just an introductory phrase, a transitional element. It's just a piece of extra information. And you want to separate that extra information in the introduction from the main sentence. And you use a comma to do that. Here's another time to use a comma. So maybe you kind of recognize what these marks are. And so here you're using a comma after said to introduce a quotation. And so this signal phrase here, Ernest Hemingway said, this is kind of acting as an introductory phrase. The main part of the sentence is here, the actual quote. So this introductory phrase or signal phrase is kind of extra information, and so we separate it from the main quote by using a comma. So here's a more complicated use of commas. We've been talking about this a little bit. Take a look at these examples. I like chocolate, especially dark chocolate and strawberries. My husband, on the other hand, prefers white chocolate. He loves, for example, white chocolate truffles. Okay, so what's happening in these sentences? What's happening here is that you're inserting some extra information. Some people call them interrupters, or a fancy grammar term is appositives. And so this information is parenthetical. It's also called a parenthetical comma phrase. So this parenthetical phrase is unnecessary. The main sentence is, I like chocolate and strawberries. My husband prefers white chocolate. So notice how this transitional element, on the other hand, is interrupting the main sentence. It's interrupting the subject and the verb. It's just put right in there. And so because it's an interrupter, I put it in comma jail. You surround that with commas. So that's how you can use a transitional element or an extra descriptive element in the middle of a sentence, and then you would surround it by commas. But be careful. Don't do this if you're adding information that is within a prepositional phrase. Prepositional phrases don't require you to put commas around them because the very nature of a prepositional phrase is to add extra unnecessary information. So this type of comma can be really difficult for students to understand when to use correctly. What I advise you to do is pay attention to commas in some of the readings that you do. When you see a comma in a reading, ask yourself, why is that comma there? What rule is this comma following? So we've talked about 4 of them so far. Here's rule number 5, and it's really related to what we just talked about. This has to do with using a comma with something, a relative pronoun. So here is an example. These 2 sentences are actually both correct, but they mean slightly different things. In the first sentence, there's no comma. That means that this information is completely necessary to the sentence. I cannot take this information out. So this information is defining which mature students are usually successful. And it's only those mature students who study hard. In my second sentence, I've used commas, which means that this information is just extra, unnecessary information. So in this case, I'm saying mature students are usually successful. So in sentence number 2, I'm saying all mature students are successful. In sentence number 1, I'm defining only certain mature students are successful. So you use a comma with non-defining clauses, which you can really think of as being a clause that contains extra information that's not really necessary to the sentence. It's not necessary grammatically, and it's not necessary for the meaning of the sentence. So here's another example of when to use a comma, and I hope this one is pretty familiar to you. I like chocolate, comma, so I eat it every day. This is a case where you are using a comma with a fanboys, so any one of these words, to join 2 complete sentences. And you do that because the fanboys alone, or the coordinating conjunction alone, isn't strong enough to hold up those 2 independent clauses. It needs help from the comma. So, and this is because we've got 2 independent clauses, one on each side. A complete sentence, I like chocolate, and a complete sentence, I eat it every day. You don't use a comma here because strawberries is not a complete sentence. So in order to use the comma with the fanboys, you have to have a subject and a verb after that fanboys. Otherwise, if you don't have an independent clause at the end, so you don't have a subject and a verb, then actually you don't use the comma, even if you're using a fanboys. All right, so here is another example which I hope will be familiar to you. Here we have a subordinate conjunction, and you guys already know the rules, right? Say it with me. When the subordinate conjunction is in the middle, you don't use a comma. When the subordinate conjunction is at the beginning, you put a comma in the middle. And why do you use that comma in the middle? You're using that comma in the middle to separate the 2 clauses. You're separating the dependent clause, you're separating it away from that independent clause, that complete sentence, the main part of the sentence. You don't need a comma, and it's incorrect to use a comma when the subordinating conjunction is in the middle, because that subordinating conjunction is really strong and it doesn't require help from a comma, unlike a coordinating conjunction, a fanboys, which is kind of a weak conjunction and it needs the help. Okay, now this one is really, can be really tricky. So in this case, I have a number of adjectives. I bought a bulky, heavy box of truffles. Okay, bulky and heavy are adjectives, and I put a comma between them. But in my next sentence, the delicious dark chocolates, okay, I have adjectives, delicious and dark, but I didn't use a comma. Why? How do you know? Well, here's the kind of tricky rule. So the comma shows that these words are coordinate adjectives. That means they can be used individually and in any order. So in other words, I can say I bought a bulky heavy box, or I bought a heavy bulky box. It doesn't matter. And I can also say I bought a bulky and heavy box. In the second sentence, I can't say the dark delicious chocolates. It sounds really weird. And I also can't say the delicious and dark chocolates, because dark is a unit with chocolate. I can't separate dark away from chocolate. I can't put it before delicious. So in that case, those types of adjectives are called cumulative adjectives. They build on one another and function as a unit. This can be really tricky to figure out. My best advice for you is, if you have more than one adjective, try to figure out if you can put an and in between those adjectives. If you can use the word and in between the adjectives, then use a comma. If you can't use the word and, then probably you shouldn't have a comma there. All right, here's a quick review. So when do we use commas? To separate elements in a list when you've got 3 or more. After a transitional element or an introductory phrase. To introduce quoted material, so after a signal phrase that introduces quoted material. To surround parenthetical phrases, in other words, to surround interrupter phrases or extra information phrases. With non-defining clauses, which really, you can think of a non-defining clause even as a parenthetical phrase. Before a fanboys, when that fanboys is joining 2 complete sentences, and each sentence is completely independent with its own subject and verb. And you also use one in the middle of a sentence when that subordinating conjunction is at the beginning, but not if the subordinating conjunction is in the middle. And finally, between coordinating adjectives, adjectives that you could use the word and in between, because those adjectives function independently of each other and can exist in any order. All right, I hope that this video helped. I'll post a second video so that you can try some practice exercises using commas.